The church bells had already stopped ringing. The petals scattered by the flower girls were damp now, trampled by boots that had long since hurried away. The guests had vanished, some in pity, most in awkward silence. Even the preacher had quietly stepped back inside, leaving only the wind and shame behind. Mabel Thorne stood alone on the steps of the chapel, her white dress creased from the weight of her sitting, her veil hanging limp over her shoulder. Her hands clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, now wilting. Like everything else she'd hoped for today, he didn't come. Not just late. He wasn't coming at all. They had whispered it for weeks. Why would a man like Edward marry a girl like her? She's got a kind heart, sure, but that waist, it'll never work. Men want a woman they can show off. Mabel had heard it all, but she'd believed Edward was different. Apparently she was wrong. Across town, beyond the last fence of Dust Hollow's edge, Calder Bishop lifted a bucket of feed over the trough and watched his chestnut gelding nuzzle into the hay. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and his back ached like it always did by midday. It had been 3 years since his wife passed. 3 years since the house grew quiet, since laughter vanished, since their son Henry stopped speaking full sentences. Calder didn't have room in his heart for new things. Not dreams, not risk, not women, but he had heard the whispers at the general store. The bride left behind, the one with the soft eyes, the one the town had already started mocking. Back at the chapel, Mabel finally rose. No one offered to walk her home. No one offered her a ride. So she walked, one step after the other, down the dusty path, carrying her shame like a train of her gown. It was nearly sundown when Calder saw her from the ridge above the trail. Her silhouette was unmistakable. A white dress against golden earth, limping slightly, head bowed. He wasn't sure what moved him. Maybe it was the weight in her shoulders. Maybe it was that he, too, had once carried something heavy and invisible. So he rode down slowly, guiding his horse beside her, but not too close. "You need a ride?" he asked quietly. Mabel looked up, startled. Her cheeks were stained, but she didn't cry anymore. There was only stillness in her eyes now. She didn't answer right away, but then she nodded. He held out his hand. She took it, and neither of them knew that what began as a ride home would end as the beginning of a new kind of family. The ride to Calder's ranch was quiet. Mabel didn't speak, and Calder didn't force conversation. The horse's gentle steps filled the space between them, a rhythm steadier than either of their breathing. When the ranch house came into view, nestled low in the hills and framed by cottonwoods and weather-worn fences, Mabel spoke her first word since getting on the saddle. "You don't have to take me all the way." Calder shook his head. "Wasn't planning to leave you halfway." He helped her down in silence, holding her a beat longer than necessary. Not out of affection, out of caution. The woman had barely eaten, and her steps wavered like someone walking through fog. "I'll make coffee," he said. She followed him inside. The house smelled of cedar smoke and dust. A few books lined the mantel. Boots rested near the hearth. A child's carved wooden horse sat forgotten near the doorframe. "This your home?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Built most of it myself. Been quiet these days." She looked around. "Quiet can be kind or cruel." Calder paused at the stove. "Depends on the kind of hurt you bring into it." They sat across from each other, mugs in hand. Mabel's dress was still wrinkled, her veil now folded on the chair beside her like a ghost. He finally asked, "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," she said. "My father's gone. Mama's passed. I sold everything to pay for the wedding Edward never showed up to." Calder looked down into his mug. "You can stay here tonight," he said after a moment. "Spare room hasn't been used in a while. It's clean." Her eyes searched his face. "You don't even know me." "No," he admitted, "but I know what it feels like to be left with nothing. That's enough." That night, Mabel lay awake in the quiet spare room. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, and somewhere down the hallway she heard the creak of old floorboards and a child's soft footsteps. In the morning she found Calder in the barn, checking fence wire. A small boy stood near him, no more than 6. Brown hair, wide eyes, clinging to a toy horse. "This is Henry," Calder said, "my boy." Henry stared at her, but said nothing. He hadn't spoken much in over a year. Mabel bent down and smiled gently. "Hi, Henry. You don't have to talk to me, but I'm glad to meet you." The boy blinked, then turned and quietly hid behind Calder's leg. Mabel didn't mind. She knew the feeling. Later, as she helped wash dishes from breakfast, she asked, "Why'd you really bring me here?" Calder dried his hands with a worn cloth. "Because I reckon nobody deserves to walk home alone in a wedding dress." He looked at her, steady. "And because this place could use some light again." Mabel wasn't sure she believed in new beginnings, but she did believe in decency. And Calder Bishop, whether he knew it or not, had just offered her the first kindness she'd been shown in a very long time. The days passed slowly on the Bishop Ranch, the kind of slow that lets silence settle into the bones. Mabel stayed, not because she asked to, but because Calder never asked her to leave. She took to simple tasks without being told. She swept the floor, patched the curtains, and mended Henry's worn flannel shirt. She did it not for gratitude, but because her hands needed to do something other than tremble. One afternoon, Calder came in from the fields with dirt on his collar and strain in his shoulders. He paused at the doorway, watching as Mabel kneaded dough on the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her cheeks pink with focus, her hair tied back in a ribbon that didn't quite match. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. She shrugged. "Bread doesn't make itself. Besides, the quiet's easier when the house smells like something warm." Henry peeked around the corner, clutching his toy horse. Mabel offered him a smile. "Want to help me shape the rolls?" He hesitated, then nodded. Tiny hands, careful and unsure, copied hers. When the rolls were shaped, she pressed one gently. "See that? You don't force it, just guide it." Calder watched the moment quietly from the doorway. A boy with a mother-shaped hole, and a woman who filled it without even knowing. That night, as the wind picked up over the hills, Mabel sat on the porch with a shawl over her shoulders. Calder joined her, 2 mugs in hand. They sat in the kind of silence that didn't need breaking. She finally asked, "Do people ever stop talking in town?" He chuckled. "Only when they're listening for more to say." She looked down. "They called me names when I was young. Too big, too quiet, too much." Calder didn't flinch. "Maybe they were just too small to carry your worth." The words hung in the air like warmth rising off a hearth. No poetry, no charm. Just truth. Inside, Henry had fallen asleep beside the fire with the bread still on his fingers. Mabel carried him gently to the cot, pulling the quilt over his small frame. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching his chest rise and fall, steady and safe. In a house that wasn't hers, she had never felt more needed. When she returned to the porch, Calder stood. "I know it's not your home," he said, "but you make it feel like one again." She met his gaze. "You don't know me yet." "I know enough." And in that moment, beneath the starlit sky and the soft creak of porch boards, something old in both of them quietly began to mend. The next morning arrived on a breeze of frost and silence. Mabel was already up, stoking the stove, while Calder hauled in firewood from the barn. She worked with a quiet rhythm now, measured and purposeful, familiar with the creak of the floorboards and the way the kettle liked to whistle just before it boiled over. At breakfast, Henry sat straighter at the table than usual. He'd taken to brushing his hair and trying to mimic Calder's posture. Mabel noticed but said nothing. She only smiled when he offered to help pass the plates. "You're becoming quite the gentleman," she said gently. Henry beamed. "I want to be like Pa." The word landed heavy in the room, not because it was wrong, but because it felt real. Later that day, Mabel stepped outside to hang the laundry. The wind tugged at the clothesline and carried the scent of pine and dry earth. As she pinned a worn shirt, a voice startled her. "You've made yourself right at home." She turned. Clara Madden, the town seamstress, and the unofficial curator of small-town whispers. Mabel steadied her hands. "Just trying to be useful." Clara tilted her head, examining her like a misplaced page in a familiar book. "People say Calder's changed since you arrived, that maybe you've set your eyes on staying." Mabel met her gaze calmly. "Is that a problem?" Clara's smile was tight. "Just curious what a woman like you might be looking for in a man like him." That evening, Calder found Mabel sitting alone under the cottonwood tree near the field, her dress brushing the autumn grass. "You all right?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just remembering how people never ask with kindness, only with doubt." He crouched beside her. "Let them talk. They always do. But they don't live here. They don't see Henry sneak you wildflowers or the way you sing under your breath when you think no one's listening." Mabel looked at him, surprised. "You hear me?" "Hard not to," he said with a quiet smile. Later, as night fell and the house settled, Mabel sat beside the hearth with Henry curled up beside her. She thought of the altar, the vows never spoken, the eyes that saw her and still turned away. And then she looked at the boy in her lap, the man tending the fire, and she realized she had not been rejected. She had been rerouted to a place where warmth had no price, and love grew in silence. The next Sunday, Calder drove them into town. Mabel wore her modest lilac dress and a navy shawl Henry had picked from the storage trunk. He'd called it her church cape, even though they weren't heading to the service, but rather to buy feed and bolts for the barn. The general store was buzzing with the usual voices, Mr. Whitby hollering about tobacco prices, Mrs. Ellingsworth insisting the flour sacks were lighter than last week. But everything grew hushed when Calder entered, with Mabel and Henry close behind. "You reckon that's the bride from that mess over in Dawson?" someone whispered near the licorice barrel. "Can't be, she's smiling." Mabel heard them. Of course she did. But she didn't let it stop her. She picked up a sack of sugar, nodded politely to the clerk, and made her way to the counter. Calder watched her from a few steps back. He didn't move to shield her. He didn't have to. She was shielding herself with grace. When they returned home, Mabel laughed softly as she stepped out of the wagon. "I think I've been stared at more in that store than I was on my would-be wedding day." Calder smirked. "Could be the way you carry yourself." She looked at him curiously. "You don't shrink," he said, "even when folks want you to." That night, as she hemmed Henry's pant cuffs by lamplight, she asked softly, "Did you ever think folks would stop talking about your loss?" Calder was quiet for a long while. "I used to think grief was like a storm that passed, but it's more like the river, always flowing, just sometimes quieter." She nodded. "Sometimes I still hear the echo of not enough." "You're more than enough, Mabel." Her hands froze on the needle. Those 5 words wrapped around her heart like the warmest quilt. Later, Calder stood on the porch alone. The stars above his ranch shimmered with the kind of stillness that came only after a hard truth had been spoken aloud. He whispered to himself, "She makes this place feel like home again." Inside, Mabel folded Henry's quilt, unaware he'd just said the things she never thought a man would say about her again. Fall rolled in slow and golden, casting long shadows over the ranch fields. The evenings turned crisp. Calder had begun closing the windows by supper, and Mabel took to baking again, her biscuits now a favorite for Henry, who asked for them even when there were beans on the stove. One Friday afternoon, Mabel found herself covered in flour, giggling as Henry attempted to help knead dough with far too much enthusiasm. "Easy now," she said, brushing his messy bangs back. "You're kneading the dough like it insulted you." "Is that how you make it soft?" he asked. She laughed. "No, that's how you make it mad." Calder leaned in from the doorway, arms crossed. "I reckon I like my biscuits with just a hint of vengeance." That night, over supper, Calder looked at the two of them, Henry bouncing his knees under the table, Mabel reaching for the butter dish with hands still dusted in flour. He hadn't seen a table this full of life in years. "Would it be all right if we had guests next Sunday?" he asked. Mabel glanced up, surprised. "Guests?" "My sister and her boys. She's been wanting to meet the woman who tamed my son." Henry grinned proudly. "I ain't tamed," Calder laughed. "Could have fooled me." The following Sunday, Calder's sister Miriam arrived with 2 boys nearly Henry's age. They tumbled out of the wagon full of stories, and the ranch echoed with the thunder of new friendships. Mabel stood back for a moment, watching it all. Boys chasing one another through the hay, Miriam hugging Calder tight, and laughter blooming like springtime in every corner. She was wiping her hands on her apron when Miriam approached her with a warm smile. "You've done something to my brother," she said. "Oh?" He smiles again. "He eats without staring out the window. He built a swing." "A swing," Mabel chuckled. "I merely bake." "No," Miriam said gently, "you belong." That night, long after the guests had gone and Henry had fallen asleep by the fire, Calder joined Mabel on the porch. "I used to think this place was for surviving," he said, "but lately it feels like living again." Mabel looked up at the sky. "That's what kitchens are for, and tables, and maybe porches like this." He didn't answer, but he reached over and placed his hand on hers, quietly. The silence said everything, and for the first time in years, Mabel felt not just welcomed, but wanted. The days began to stitch together like a patchwork quilt, warm, dependable, and comforting. Mabel found her rhythm on the ranch, tending the hens, patching Henry's shirts, walking the fields in the cool of morning with a basket on her arm. But something else had taken root in her, something softer, quieter. Every time Calder brushed past her shoulder, every glance he held a beat too long, every silence between them seemed to thrum with something unspoken. Still, neither dared to name it. One morning, Mabel woke early to the sound of heavy rain on the roof. She pulled a shawl tight around her shoulders and padded into the kitchen. Calder was already there, nursing coffee by the window, staring out over the mist-covered hills. "Can't ride out in this," he muttered. She poured herself a cup. "Then maybe it's a day for baking." He smiled. "That mean I get another shot at your blueberry pie?" "That depends. You gonna steal a slice before dinner again?" "I might." They both laughed, and the sound filled the small kitchen like firelight. As the day wore on, they found themselves working side by side, Mabel kneading, Calder chopping kindling, Henry building a cardboard fort out of old shipping boxes. It was simple, mundane, and perfect. Later that evening, Calder found her alone on the porch, watching the rain. You know, he said softly, I've lived through storms before, but none ever made me want to slow down like this one. She turned to him, her eyes steady. Maybe slowing down isn't always a bad thing. He hesitated. Mabel, you've given this place something I thought it couldn't feel again. She looked down. And you've given me something I never thought I'd deserve. His hand reached for hers, fingers trembling just slightly. Do you think there's a chance for something more between us? He asked, voice low, raw. Mabel stared at him, heart racing like thunder beneath her ribs. I think, she said carefully, it's already begun. Inside, the rain softened to a whisper, and so did their hearts. After that quiet confession on the porch, things didn't change outwardly, but everything felt different. There were still fences to mend and chores to run, but beneath it all simmered a tender current, one that made Calder's smile warmer, Mabel's voice gentler, and even Henry's laughter lighter. The boy had taken to Mabel in ways Calder could never have imagined. He'd come to her for stories, for help with his boots, even for comfort when he skinned his knee. One evening, as she brushed dirt from Henry's sleeves, he whispered, Are you going to be my new mom? The question hit like a gust of wind through a hollow house. She crouched down. Do you want me to be? Henry nodded. You make better pancakes than anyone, and you hug real soft. Her eyes misted. Well, I'll always be here for you, however you need me. But even as love bloomed in that weathered house, old shadows crept in. It started with a letter. Calder found it in town, folded once with no return address. The handwriting was delicate, almost trembling. To Mabel Hastings. You can't hide from shame. I'll be coming soon. No signature. Calder read it twice before sliding it into his coat pocket, unsure whether to show her. When he finally did, her hands trembled. It's from Aunt Bertha, she said quietly. Or maybe Clara's father. I didn't leave that life the way polite people do. Do you want me to send word to the marshal? Calder asked. No, she said firmly. If someone's coming, I won't hide. I'm not that woman anymore. He looked at her, at the strength in her chin despite the fear in her eyes. I know, he said. I know exactly who you are now. And you're not alone. That night, Mabel sat by the window long after Calder and Henry had gone to bed. The wind whispered through the trees, stirring the ghosts of the past. But she didn't flinch. She was done running. Whatever storm approached, she'd face it head on, with her sleeves rolled up, her boots on, and this new family behind her. The next morning brought gray skies and a bitter wind, as if the land itself knew something was coming. Mabel woke early and tied her apron, every motion precise. Calder watched her from the doorway, his hat in hand, concern etched into the lines of his face. I'll take the wagon into town, he offered. Maybe find out who's been asking around. She shook her head. If someone's looking for me, they'll come here. That's the kind of confrontation I've avoided all my life. He walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. And now, I've got something worth standing my ground for. By noon, the sky opened. Rain fell in heavy sheets. Mabel sat with Henry near the hearth, reading an old children's book. Every knock of wind against the shutters made her heart jump. Then came the sound of hooves. 2 riders appeared beyond the rain, dark silhouettes creeping down the muddy road. Calder stepped onto the porch as the figures came into view. One dismounted with a practiced grace, an older woman with a stiff jaw and eyes that cut like knives. Mabel Hastings, she called, voice sharp even through the storm. Or are you calling yourself something else these days? Mabel stepped beside Calder. Still Mabel, she said, calm and firm. But this time no one speaks for me. The woman removed her soaked gloves slowly, her eyes never leaving Mabel's. I'm Clara's mother, and you shamed my son. You left our family in ruin. I left because your son tried to turn me into something I wasn't, Mabel said, and I won't apologize for surviving. There was a pause. The second rider remained silent. A younger man, maybe Clara's brother. The tension was heavy, nearly cracking under its own weight. The older woman narrowed her eyes. You think this new life, this man, washes away your past? No, Mabel said. But it proves I'm more than it. Calder stepped forward, his voice steady. Ma'am, whatever you came to take back or ruin, you'll find nothing here but peace. We don't want trouble, but we won't back down from it. The woman stared at them both, her gaze flicking to the house, to the fire glowing through the windows, and finally to the boy peeking from behind the curtain. Something in her shifted. Keep your distance, she said quietly, then mounted her horse again. But don't think the past forgets. They rode off. No shots fired, no insults screamed, just a threat that faded with the storm. But as the sun broke through the clouds, Calder turned to Mabel. You did it, he said. She leaned against him, tired but unbroken. We did it. The rain stopped by late afternoon, leaving the land glistening and silent. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds reclaiming the quiet. Mabel stood by the barn, watching the sunlight filter through the dissipating clouds. She wasn't trembling anymore. Calder came up behind her with 2 mugs of coffee. Thought you could use something warm. She took the cup with a small smile. Thanks. I wasn't sure how I'd feel once they left. He nodded. Sometimes the waiting is worse than the storm. They stood together in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. She looked out at the fields, then to the farmhouse that had slowly become her own. You know, she said, I never imagined this kind of life. Not with a man like you. Not with a boy who hugs me before bed. You think I imagined this either? He chuckled. A strong-willed bride who bakes better than anyone I've ever met and still wins arguments with Henry like it's a sport? She laughed, and for the first time in a long while her laughter had no trace of apology. Later that evening, Henry joined them at the table with a sheet of paper folded into quarters. What's that? Calder asked. It's a drawing, Henry said proudly, of us. Mabel opened it carefully. 3 stick figures stood in front of a square with a triangle roof. A sun beamed in the top corner, and all the figures were smiling. Calder reached across the table and ruffled Henry's hair. Looks like we're officially a team. Henry grinned, then glanced at Mabel. Does this mean you're staying forever? She reached for his hand. If you'll have me. He nodded furiously. That night, after Henry was asleep and the fire crackled low, Calder found Mabel on the porch wrapped in a blanket. You've been through a lot, he said softly. And I won't rush you, Mabel. But I need you to know. This isn't charity. This isn't rescue. She turned to face him, her eyes glassy in the glow of the lantern. I know, she whispered. You gave me more than shelter, Calder. You gave me a place to grow. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Then grow with me, however long it takes, however you need. She leaned into him, head resting against his chest. In the darkness, there were no doubts, no ghosts. Just 2 people who had been broken and rebuilt by kindness. Sunlight spilled across the farmhouse kitchen, golden and warm like melted butter on a skillet. Mabel stood barefoot, apron tied hastily over her nightdress, her hands dusted with flour. The biscuits were rising in the oven, and coffee burbled gently in the percolator. She hadn't slept much, not from fear or anxiety, but from something new. Hope. It was unfamiliar but welcome, like spring air after a long winter. Henry padded in quietly, his hair tousled from sleep. It smells like a Sunday morning, he mumbled, climbing up to the table. That's because we're celebrating, Mabel said, placing a small jar of peach preserves in front of him. First day of our forever. Forever's a long time, he said with a grin, biting into a warm biscuit. It is, Calder replied, entering the room with his sleeves rolled up. But some things are worth the time. Later that morning, Calder took them out to the back pasture where the view stretched wide toward the hills. He led Mabel to a spot shaded by a single oak, where a new swing had been hung. This was Henry's idea, he said. Said you never had one growing up. She blinked in surprise. You remembered that? I remember everything you say, Mabel, because I never want to miss a thing that makes you who you are. The swing swayed gently in the breeze as Mabel sat, her hands gripping the ropes. Calder gave her a light push, and she laughed, feet lifting off the ground. Henry clapped from the side, his own laughter echoing. As the days passed, word spread through town, not just of Calder taking in a bride who had been left behind, but of something more, of a woman who didn't shrink under judgment, of a man who saw beyond what others dismissed, of a boy who found his mother not in blood, but in the warmth of daily love. They became a family the town didn't see coming, and when people whispered about them at church or in the general store, Mabel no longer looked away. She held her head high, knowing her worth didn't depend on the world's approval. It was carved into the way Calder looked at her when she wasn't watching. That night, Calder brought a small wrapped box to the porch. No occasion, he said. Just because I'm glad you're here. Inside was a brooch. Simple, gold, shaped like a wheat stalk. She looked at him, touched. Why this? He smiled softly. Because you're strong, and you feed everything you touch. The weather turned rough that week. Thick clouds hung low over the land, and a sharp wind carried dust across the plains. The ranch seemed to brace itself, the animals restless, the fences creaking in protest. Mabel stood on the porch, watching the horizon. Calder joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. Storm's coming, he muttered. She leaned into him. We've weathered worse. That night, thunder cracked like gunfire. The rain came hard and fast, a deluge pounding the tin roof. Henry stirred in his sleep, whimpering at the noise. Mabel rushed to his room, smoothing his hair. "It's just the sky letting off some steam, sweetheart. Nothing's gonna hurt us, you're safe." Calder appeared in the doorway. "I'll check the barn," he said, already shrugging on his coat. She followed without a word. The barn was chaos. Rain driving in through a broken window, a calf tangled in rope, the horses spooked. Calder moved with calm certainty, his voice low and steady. Mabel climbed into the stall beside him, helping free the calf. Their hands met in the mud and straw. "You didn't have to come," he said, pulling her close after. "I know," she answered, "but I'm not letting you face any storm alone." By morning, the rain had stopped. The ranch was soaked but safe. Mabel boiled water for coffee while Henry played with his toy horse on the floor, completely unfazed by the storm that had passed. Calder came in, shirt damp, hair dripping. He took one look at her and grinned. "I think I love you," he said, matter of fact, like it had been on his mind for a while and there was no reason to keep it hidden anymore. Mabel froze for a moment, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "You think?" He stepped closer. "No, I know." She let out a shaky breath. "Say it again." "I love you." That night, they didn't speak of it again. They didn't have to. The way he dried her hands after dinner, the way she tucked Henry in while Calder leaned in the doorway, all of it said more than words ever could. And as Mabel lay in bed with the storm now a distant memory, she thought to herself, some storms aren't meant to destroy. Some just clear the way. By spring, the land had softened, and so had their lives. Mabel found herself humming while hanging laundry on the line. Henry ran barefoot across the yard with Scout chasing after him, and Calder worked near the fence, replacing rotted posts. There was rhythm now, quiet peace, a sense of belonging that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, a dusty stagecoach pulled into town. Mabel watched from the mercantile as a tall, rigid woman stepped down in lace gloves and judgmental eyes. "Mother," Calder muttered behind her, voice tight. They didn't speak much on the way back to the ranch. Calder's mother, Eugenia, sat upright in the wagon seat, her lips pursed as she took in the landscape. "This land still smells like sweat and soil," she said. "I suppose not much has changed." Calder said nothing. At the house, Eugenia was greeted by a smiling Mabel and a curious Henry. "This must be the boy," Eugenia said coolly. "And you must be the one I've heard so little about." Mabel extended a hand. "Welcome, ma'am. We're glad you're here." Dinner was stiff. Eugenia picked at her stew. "I always imagined Calder would marry someone refined, someone with a lighter touch." Calder's brow furrowed, but Mabel kept her voice even. "I may not be refined, but I love this ranch. I love Calder, and I love Henry like he's my own." The silence was thick. Then, unexpectedly, Eugenia looked toward the boy who had fallen asleep at the table, head resting on his arm. She sighed. "He looks like Clara did at that age." Calder's voice softened. "He misses her." "We all do," Eugenia whispered. That night, Calder apologized. "She's sharp, Mabel, and proud, but she's not cruel. She just doesn't understand what you've done for us." Mabel shook her head. "She doesn't have to understand right away, but she'll see it. Love doesn't always wear lace and pearls." He smiled. "You wear strength better than silk, anyway." By the end of the week, Eugenia watched Mabel gently teach Henry how to knead bread. She observed Calder reach for Mabel's hand without thinking, and she noticed the ranch, thriving under their care, steadied by a woman once cast aside. On her last morning, Eugenia took Mabel aside. "My son is stubborn, and my grandson needs a mother. They are better for having you. So is this place." Mabel didn't answer with words. She just smiled, because sometimes acceptance speaks loudest when it's quiet. By midsummer, the skies over Montana were as temperamental as a young foal. Sun one moment, lightning the next. Calder and Mabel had just finished reinforcing the west barn roof when the wind shifted. It carried more than the scent of pine and dust. It carried warning. They hurried Henry inside as the first fat drops hit the ground. Within minutes, thunder boomed like a cannon, and the heavens split open in a storm that seemed to rattle the bones of the house. Inside, Mabel lit lanterns while Calder secured every window. They gathered by the fireplace as rain lashed the walls. "Is the barn going to hold?" Henry asked, eyes wide. Calder knelt and pulled him close. "We've patched her up good. She's stronger than she looks." Mabel caught Calder's eye over the boy's head, the subtext not lost on either of them. They were all stronger than they looked. As the storm raged, Calder opened up more than he ever had. He spoke of Clara, his late wife, how she had once braided his hair when he fell asleep in the field, how she used to sing off-key on purpose just to make Henry laugh, and how her silence during her final days had broken him more than her passing. "I was hollow, Mabel. I didn't know I was allowed to be full again." he whispered. Mabel listened, never interrupting. I don't compare you. It's not that. It's just, sometimes I'm afraid I'll fail again. That I'll love you the same way, then lose you too. Mabel reached for his hand. You won't lose me, Calder. And I'm not asking you to replace her. I just want a place in your story. He pulled her into a quiet embrace, and for a long time, they simply breathed in sync with the storm. The next morning, the sun returned as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Not in the house. In them. Mabel began carving her initials beside Calder's on the beam above the front door, right below Henry's, and Calder didn't stop her. Because family, real family, wasn't measured by blood or vows. It was etched in small acts, in shared silences, and in surviving storms side by side. Late August brought cooler mornings and golden afternoons. The leaves began to whisper of change, though summer hadn't yet let go of its reign. Calder noticed it first, the way Henry no longer called Mabel Miss. It had simply become Ma one day, softly, almost shyly. Mabel turned when he said it the first time, blinking rapidly as she fought tears. She didn't correct him. She just smiled and pulled him into a quiet hug. The boy didn't need to explain. He had chosen her. That weekend, the town fair rolled into Ash Hollow with the scent of roasted corn and the creak of Ferris wheels. Mabel, hesitant at first, agreed to go. It would be her first public outing in a town that still whispered behind her back. But things had changed more than she realized. Women who once turned cold shoulders now waved politely. The baker, whose son had stood Mabel up at the altar, offered her a slice of peach pie on the house. He was a fool, the woman said simply. We all were. Calder stood nearby the entire time, not to protect, but to witness. Mabel's grace humbled him. That evening, under strung lights and distant music, Calder led Mabel away from the crowd and toward the edge of the fairgrounds. There, beneath an old oak, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered ring. It was my mother's, he said. I carried it with me through war, drought, and loss. I never thought I'd give it to anyone. Mabel's breath caught. I ain't asking for a wedding tomorrow or even next month, but I am asking this. His voice faltered, but his eyes didn't waver. Stay, not just here in my life, as my partner, as Henry's mother, as my home. Mabel didn't speak right away. She took his hand, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. Yes, she whispered. And the moment stretched between them, long and golden like the dusk that cradled the horizon. They returned to the fair hand in hand. No parade, no announcement, just two people who had been broken by the world and dared to build something whole from the pieces. The days after Calder's proposal flowed like a gentle stream, quiet, healing, and full of small joys. Mabel woke each morning before the sun to make breakfast for Henry and Calder. She still wore the simple locket she'd come with, now hanging beside the ring on a chain near her heart. But life, no matter how sweet, always has a way of testing love. A letter arrived one late morning, its envelope bearing the delicate, looping script of someone who hadn't written in years. It was from Mabel's mother. I heard where you ended up. I'd like to see you, if you'll have me. Mabel stood by the stove, the letter trembling in her hand. Calder watched from the door. You okay? He asked gently. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't seen her since I was turned away at our church steps. Alone. That Sunday, Mabel rode into town not for errands, but to meet her past. Her mother sat in the back pew of the same church that once turned Mabel away. She looked older than Mabel remembered. Softer even. They spoke in hushed tones at the edge of the chapel. The words were careful, hesitant, each one a thread attempting to mend something too long unraveled. I should have stood up for you, her mother said at last, eyes moist. I was afraid of what people would say, of losing standing. You lost me, Mabel said simply. Silence settled. Then her mother whispered, Can I meet him? The boy? Later that week, Mabel stood beside Calder and Henry as her mother approached their homestead. Henry, cautious but curious, held Mabel's hand tightly. Calder gave a respectful nod. Mabel watched as the woman who once rejected her knelt in front of the boy she now called son. I missed so much, her mother murmured. Henry looked up, thoughtful. You can still come to dinner, he said quietly. Ma makes good peach cobbler. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door opening. That night, as the stars rolled across the sky like drifting cattle, Mabel leaned against Calder on the porch swing. You did something hard today, he whispered. So did you, raising a boy without knowing what tomorrow held. They sat in the hush of evening, hearts threaded together by choice, not fate, and it was enough. The weeks following her mother's visit settled like spring after a harsh winter, soft, cautious, and blooming in unexpected corners. Mabel no longer walked with hesitation. She walked with quiet confidence, the kind that comes not from being chosen, but from knowing she is enough. Calder saw it too. Every time she stepped into the kitchen or helped Henry with his schoolwork, every time she walked the pasture lines with a kerchief in her hair, he felt a quiet awe in his chest. One golden afternoon, while Henry played with two neighbor boys near the fence line, Calder was fixing the north paddock gate. Mabel brought him lemonade in a chipped mason jar, her fingers brushing his. "I saw you eyeing the garden plot this morning," he said. "I'm thinking of adding more, maybe carrots, maybe rhubarb. Something to put in a pie?" he teased. "Maybe something to build a life with," she said softly. Calder paused, looked at her. "You've already built it," he said. "We just happened to find it together." That night, Mabel found Henry sitting quietly in his room. He was clutching a crumpled drawing, one he'd made of her, Calder, and himself, all holding hands under a crooked sun. "Are we real now?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Like a real family?" Mabel knelt beside him, her voice thick. "Henry, we've been real since the first time you called me Ma." He threw his arms around her, and for the first time Mabel allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from release. Later, Calder stood by the fireplace, smoothing the edges of a weathered wooden box. "I've been saving this," he said as Mabel approached. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with a small heart and initials, C and M. "It was meant to be a wedding gift," he said, "but I figure love doesn't always wait for ceremony." She placed it on her wrist, where it fit, as if it had always belonged. That evening, with the smell of fresh biscuits and wood smoke in the air, they sat around the kitchen table, the three of them. No grandeur, no crowds, just hands holding, laughter between bites, and a dog resting at their feet. It wasn't the life Mabel imagined. It was better, because it was theirs. The first snow of the season came early that year, soft flakes drifting down like whispers over the pastures and barn roofs. It settled in gentle silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath for something sacred. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around the little family. Mabel stood by the window, a steaming mug in her hands, watching Henry chase a pup through the shallow snow. Calder was behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder. "You ever think how strange it is," he murmured, "that the worst day of your life can lead you to the best place you've ever known?" She nodded. "Sometimes blessings look a lot like endings first." He leaned in and kissed her temple. "And sometimes they look like you." Later that day, Calder rode into town alone. Mabel stayed behind, tending to the laundry, mending Henry's mittens, and humming soft tunes as she worked. When Calder returned, he carried something small in his coat pocket, and a look in his eyes that made her heart thump. That night, after Henry had gone to bed and the house had settled, Calder brought out a box, modest, velvet-lined, and simple. "I didn't have much when I came back to this ranch," he said. "Just a broken heart and a boy who needed more than I knew how to give. But you, Mabel, you gave both of us something we didn't know we were missing." He opened the box to reveal a gold ring, delicate but strong, with a small carved feather etched into its side. "I don't need a preacher or a big ceremony, I just need you. Will you wear this, not because the world says we need titles, but because I want you to know that this home, this life, it's yours, fully." Mabel stared at the ring for a moment, then reached out, eyes brimming. "It already is," she whispered. By the time Henry woke the next morning, the whole world outside looked brand new, covered in white, glistening with frost and possibility. And inside, his little family felt more whole than it had ever been. No one else had to understand how they got here. No one else had to approve. Because under that old tin roof, with 3 mismatched chairs and a fire that never went out, they had everything they needed. And for the first time in forever, Mabel didn't feel like someone trying to fit in. She felt like someone who belonged. The days that followed were the quiet kind, the kind that didn't make headlines or fill storybooks, but were the very ones Mabel used to dream of during her loneliest nights. No drama, no crowds, just life, as steady and warm as Calder's hand on her lower back whenever they crossed paths in the kitchen. Henry had started calling her Mama without prompting one chilly evening while helping her gather kindling. The word came out soft, unsure, like he was testing it for the first time. Mabel had frozen in place, heart pounding. She turned and knelt beside him, her breath fogging between them. "Is that okay?" he asked, eyes wide. She pulled him into her arms and held him tight. "That's more than okay, sweetheart. That's everything." From then on, he said it without hesitation. Calder, too, had softened. Where once there had been grief shadowing his gaze, now lived light. He laughed more, worked less, And when he looked at Mabel, it was never through the lens of her past. It was through the gratitude of his own present. On Sundays, they visited the little chapel on the hill. Mabel would bring biscuits to share, and Calder always tipped his hat to every widow and ranch hand. Word around town had shifted. Where once people whispered about the bride left at the altar, they now nodded with quiet respect for the woman who had carved out something beautiful from pain. One morning a letter arrived. It was from the man who had humiliated her, her former fiancé. Apologetic, rambling, regretful. Mabel folded it neatly and placed it into the fireplace without a word. "What'd it say?" Calder asked. "Nothing worth reading twice," she said. And just like that, the final chain around her past turned to ash. That night, the three of them sat on the porch. Henry balanced between their chairs, wrapped in a blanket, sipping cider. The stars blinked above, and the world felt endlessly wide, yet peacefully small. "You think life always works out like this?" she asked Calder. He chuckled. "No, but I think when it does, you hold on tight and don't question it." She reached for his hand. "Then I won't." Spring painted the ranch in hues of gold and green, and for the first time in years, Mabel looked in the mirror and didn't wince. She saw the same woman, soft around the edges, strong where life had made her be, but now with something new in her eyes. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from silence or solitude. The kind that comes from being loved without conditions. The kind that comes from knowing you belong. Calder had a surprise waiting for her in the barn that morning. A new sign, fresh wood, carefully carved, hanging proudly above the doors. "The Thorne family ranch." She blinked. "You didn't—" "I did," he said, voice thick. "Because it's ours now. You, me, Henry, this land, this life." Her eyes welled with tears she didn't try to hide. She stepped into his arms, grounding herself in the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Later that week, they held a small ceremony under the old oak tree by the river. No altar, no crowd, just them, Henry, a few close friends, and the wind whispering through the leaves like a hymn. Mabel wore a dress she'd sewn herself. Simple, strong, just like her. Calder looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, his hands trembling only slightly as he took hers. "I never thought I'd get a second chance," he said. "But you were never my second. You were just the missing piece." They kissed, and Henry clapped, and someone played an old fiddle tune that made even the river smile. And when the sun dipped low and the fireflies danced around their boots, Mabel whispered a promise not into the wind, but into Calder's ear. "I'll never stop being the woman who fought to get here. But now, I finally get to rest."